Did anyone get a chance to see the talk on the 19th?
Yeah.
What's his name?
I can't remember, but I'll check it. Yeah, I was there.
Fabricio posted on our page, on the Neuroseminar page.
Peter Gardner, of course.
Peter Gardner. And well, I hope the talk was better than this recorded lecture.
It was similar, but it was very interesting. The main thing that, I don't know, nobody that was there is here, but the main thing that caught my attention is the extent to which his observations are compatible with interpretative anthropology. That was what struck me the hardest. I mean, that he was doing mostly a biological model, but a lot of what he was talking about was in the same venue and in the same model that Gertz proposes in the interpretation of cultures, which I thought was fascinating. That his research and the research that's been conducted with primates has been, if anything, confirming some of the hypotheses in interpretative anthropology. So that was something that I found was really, really interesting about the whole model that he was proposing of intelligence. And the other thing that caught my attention, and I think it goes straight to the point, is that it's a representational model. I mean, it understands culture as representation. And I am myself very interested in this debate, and I think it touches your research too.
Yeah, it touches, and that's why I'm asking about it, because I saw the lecture that we have from on the site, and well, I was somewhat disappointed, I have to say, because well, perhaps after a few months of dealing with this genius here, Chomsky, other people seem less intelligent, perhaps a little bit, but his strategy was extremely descriptive, Gardner. And one of the big claims that Chomsky and his team are putting forward is the idea that language, or at least I language, right, what we're going to be working on still today, all of the I language, and of course last time we were using the initial terminology, generative grammar, and the universal grammar, which is still, the universal grammar is still used by Chomsky, although it includes I language and E language. And this referring, of course, to a language faculty. And the language faculty is part of the brain, which is the claim. So we can say that the universal grammar, in some sense, or even, I think the distinction, we were having this discussion last week, is the universal grammar the language faculty? Well, Chomsky seems to have been a bit more moderate in recent interviews, let's say, that I've come across, where he'll say that, well, universal grammar is a hypothesis, is a theory, but language faculty is the thing. And more so when he develops really the idea of the I language, I referring to innate, internal, also due to the specificities of English, the language of the individual self. And E language would be the externalized language. In some sense, there could be, of course, I'm always very hesitant about making some things that I don't see directly in Chomsky's work, since he insists on staying so close to the text. But there could be some type of parallel here between principles. I'm not even sure if I want to risk that, saying that, but I'll throw it out and then I'll say why we shouldn't do it. Principles and parameters analogy. The principles and parameters model is the model that he introduces in the late 1970s, particularly in the book called On Government and Binding, which is the so-called famous Pisa lectures, which establishes also his working relationship with an Italian group, not only in Pisa, but in Rome, where Andrea Moro works. And I'm happy to say that in some recent talks that he's given, he refers very, very positively to Andrea Moro. And after setting up the book again, I'd like to show about a 20-minute talk that Chomsky gives in the lecture or the conference that Fabrizio also dug up, which is a commemoration of the famous Building 20 at MIT, which was built in the 1950s, and pretty much is the heart and soul, as they say, a building with a soul to MIT, and saw all of basically all the big projects at MIT being developed there. And about 3 years ago, it was, if I'm not mistaken, it was actually destroyed or dismantled, and there's a new building which is designed by Frank Gehry, and it's well worth checking out. It's an architectural masterpiece if you're into Frank Gehry's work. But in any case, it's actually not a debate on Chomsky. It's an invitation made to some leading researchers of MIT, and each one is asked to give about a 10-minute, it's moderated by Steven Pinker, and each one of these figures, like Marvin Minsky, for example, is asked to give a 10-minute recollection of some type of anecdote or experience there. And while, of course, Chomsky gets up and he speaks for about half an hour just on linguistics, and forgets about any type of... he recalls one anecdote about there not being air conditioning in the building in the 1950s, and how they had to set up their own air conditioning systems. So we're gonna have a look at that. I also want to... Why are we having a look at so much Chomsky? If you've read the book by Moro, you'll see that the first chapter, A Certain History of Neurobiology, is necessary for him to completely set up the model, the experimental model. He conducts two specific types of experiments, right? Using magnetic resonance. And one of them is to feed grammatically incorrect sentences to a selection of patients, a very small group, in fact. After, to use the neuroimaging to see what parts of the brain are being activated in the moments when the incorrect sentences are being fed. And what he discovers is something interesting, that there is activation of certain parts of the brain which are not certain neural networks, which are not specifically located in what was previously, let's say through the 19th century, early 20th century, conceived as possibly housing or locating a part, a major part or a small part of the language use, which is the Broca area. We'll have a look at some pictures after. So what he sees is activation, a neural network being activated when grammatically incorrect sentences are read by the patient, because the idea is that the patient lies down in both the PET scan and then the magnetic resonance machines, and they read text. And what he sees is that there's a neural network set up outside of the Broca area, which identifies, in some sense, recognizes, in some sense, the grammatically incorrect sentence. So it lights up in a way that is specific to reading the incorrect sentences as opposed to reading the grammatically correct sentences. So why is that significant? Because the claim is being made, particularly in this model, the principles and parameters model, that you just can't invent any kind of language. you can't, not because we can't imagine it, we're not speaking here about imagining languages after we've acquired language. We're speaking about inventing the language that you will acquire. That there are specific parameters in the organism, biologically established, that determine the type of sentence strings or strings of words to construct sentences that any human speaker can develop. And that there is a mechanism, let's say there would be a biologically determined mechanism that identifies grammatically incorrect sentences and selects between two. So this is all the whole question based on the whole question of the language acquisition theory in children, how children are able to acquire a considerable amount of sentence construction from a very small amount of stimulus. This is the poverty of stimulus argument, without being taught sentence structure. So, of course, the idea that, well, children are only imitating parents when they do that, only imitating others or other children, of course, this is a possibility that there's imitation going on, but the thing is that how do we explain imitation then? And as a background to the book, there's also this whole question of the mirror neurons, or mirror cells in the brain, which have been identified in primates, particularly chimpanzees, not identified in humans as yet, but there's a working hypothesis used by many neuroscientists that these cells might be able to explain imitative patterns. Some more hasty or eager researchers will call these cells the intersubjective cells, meaning that these cells light up when the subject sees an action being performed and then performs the action. But the thing is, the results here don't point to mirror cells as being activated, the supposed site of mirror cells is being activated in the recognition of grammatically incorrect sentences. So it seems that mirror cells would not be involved in language or language imitation per se. Okay? So this is one of the experiments. The other experiment is to actually train a control group to learn different languages and to learn an impossible language, again made up of sentences that cannot be grammatically correct in any language that we know of. Okay? And we get similar types of, or more get similar types of
These mirror
results.
cells, do they correspond to an anatomical localization? These mirror cells?
They do, but my anatomical knowledge is not that sharp to be able to tell you where exactly.
But they do.
Well, at least in chimpanzees,
Oh,
tests have not shown anything in humans. It's just a working hypothesis that there probably are mirror cells. If we base our knowledge of the development of the brain on evolution and on selection of traits that can be identified in other primates and that might prove to be advantageous for human survival. However, and this is why I also refer to the lecture, the title of which was
Homo became sapiens.
yeah, how Homo became sapiens on the evolution of thought, right? And Chomsky and his group argue that language is not the result of natural selection. Now, what is it the result of? Well, Chomsky most of the time speaks of a genetic a genetic mutation is having occurred. But, and this genetic mutation will have occurred, or would have occurred, in a very small group of Homo sapiens living in Africa, and possibly accounting for the beginning of the migration of Homo sapiens out of Africa sometime about 50 to 60,000 years ago. Now, there's the question of whether Homo neanderthalis also spoke, but of course this is the possible question to determine. But there's been some recent news, just a paragraph, just opening parentheses, or a brief aside. There's been some recent findings published on how now it's proven that Homo sapiens are all 5% Homo neanderthalis. So within our genome, we've integrated 5% of genes coming from Neanderthalis, which does not mean that they weren't wiped out, but it does mean that there was some type of interbreeding. In the most recent New York Review of Books, there's some discussion on this. So the thing is about this approach here, the descriptive anthropology approach, is that it's not language-based, right? And it's not language-based because, well, you can't really, when you're doing paleoanthropology, you don't have language as an artifact, right? So I find it very problematic when the scientist speaks about planning, decision-making, and intelligence in a context in which we have only the effects to see, meaning that, well, if individuals get together and hunt down together a mammoth, it must suggest that there was some type of planning involved. The whole question, I think, from the philosophical angle is what is planning? And once again, almost symptomatically, the researcher identifies himself as being a scientist, gives a quick brush off of philosophy in this lecture at the very beginning of the lecture to not complicate things, and then goes on giving his rendition of how planning belonged to Homo erectus, and not only Homo sapiens, and the research data is not fundamental to support every one of the claims he makes, because in this lecture here, he leaves all the data out, and it's just a bunch of classifications and types of planning and types of empathy and so on and so forth. I don't know, I don't find this type of approach very convincing, particularly when we aren't looking at this very specific research data that leads us to make these claims, because the whole approach, the whole methodology suggests that the conclusions are derived from the data and not some type of speculative reconstruction. But when the researcher uses terminology or phrasing of the sort, I believe that it's like this, I have a hard time following let's say, the scientific nature of the research. So what's interesting in the Morrow book is that you have a type of workshop on setting up an experiment and deriving conclusions and doubts, mainly doubts from the experimental results. And that's why I highly recommend the book. And that's why he spends so much time discussing Chomsky in the first part, because he has to make sure that all of the items that will come into play, things like non-localization of linguistic phenomena in the brain, because that's basically the hypothesis that we're working on in the whole language faculty, is based on the idea that there's no, that language use would be part of perhaps an accidental merger of processes that were not initially designed to result in spoken, reflective, conceptual, and intentional language, structured in sentences. Chomsky even goes as far as saying that due to the impossibility of stopping the flow of consciousness, which is the flow of internal language, language probably has other functions that are unconscious to the organism, but are regulated by means of the production of sentences, at least in the human being. Of course, this also, just to recall, this also suggests that I language is not, it was not developed for communicative purposes. That various types of animals, and not only mammals, are able to communicate, and that's not in question here. What's in question is that communication basically transmits strings of sounds and perhaps symbols, although until now we haven't been able to identify non-human animals as having the capacity to construct these messages in sentence form. So the big difference here is that we're working on this specificity, special capacity, competence in human beings to create sentences. So the first part of the book is basically setting up this whole theoretical background of Chomsky's research project. The second chapter is devoted to the experiments, and the descriptions are very detailed. If we have time, perhaps we can look at some of these details. But he describes extremely well, what remains much of a mystery for us still, even though we're part of the Brain Institute research group, and as to how the actual use of the machines takes place, what can we expect from PET scans, who can be submitted to PET scan experiments, who can be submitted to fMRI experiments, for how much time, what are the risks involved, and then the whole question of correlation. On what basis this correlation take place? We were very fortunate to have one of our colleagues last year give us some indications of the very tight constraints and the considerable costs involved in carrying out these experiments, which is rarely reflected in the great enthusiasm and optimism behind correlative conclusions or results. Correlation is one of the hardest things to achieve, and particularly correlation here in terms of localizing various aspects of I language or of the language faculty is the basis from which Chomsky and his research groups or related research groups leave, so that they feel that type of correlation is not possible. There's perhaps no such thing as language per se, but there are different processes. So just before getting back into the book, I want to have a look here quickly at a nice type of popularized article published by Chomsky with two of his colleagues, Mark Hauser and Tecumseh Fitch, on the faculty of language. What is it? Who has it? How did it evolve? And just looking at, are we able to see these? Is it out of focus? Where do I put the? Yeah, sort of give us some more.
This paper we have, do we?
No, this, I'll give the reference to Fabrizio, right? Because there's so much bibliography, I didn't want to, I didn't want to bog down the bibliography. This is from Science from 2002.
Okay.
Can
I already found it.
You got it?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it's
No, it's here. I'm sending it to the group.
It's easily available. I think we should have a look here at the abstract. We argued that understanding of the faculty of language requires substantial interdisciplinary cooperation. We suggest how current developments in linguistics can be profitably wedded to work in evolutionary biology, anthropology, psychology, and neuroscience. We submit that a distinction should be made between the faculty of language in the broad sense and in the narrow sense. So FLB includes a sensory motor system, a conceptual intentional system, and the computational mechanisms for recursion, providing the capacity to generate an infinite range of expressions from a finite set of elements. So this is what we're speaking about on the first Humboldtian description of language competence or language capacity, and on the other hand, the whole idea of the poverty of stimulus. And we hypothesize that so the faculty of language in the narrow sense, FLN, only includes recursion and is the only uniquely human component of the faculty of language. So we further argue that FLN may have evolved for reasons other than language. Hence, comparative studies might look for evidence of such computations outside of the domain of communication, for example, number application, social relations. Okay, so this is an abstract that is put in a much more diplomatic terminology than Chomsky usually is known to speak in. Back to this here. Oh, I guess this is the problem. Okay. So, just let's have a look just quickly at the figures here, which really contextualize a lot that Moro develops in the first two chapters. So the animal kingdom has been designed on the basis of highly conserved developmental systems that read an almost universal language coded in DNA base pairs. The system shown on the left in terms of a phylogenetic tree, and in contrast, animals lack a common universal code of communication indicated on the right by unconnected animal groups. This is another aspect of communication versus language. Right? So here the claim is being made that there's a lack of a common universal code to communication, whereas one of the great discoveries that seems to be sustainable and proven by the project in Universal Grammar is that despite the extreme diversity of languages spoken by human beings, they all are reducible to universal grammar. Now, universal grammar is not only, of course, subject, phrase, verb, phrase, etc. We have different positions allowed in the sentence construction, but these positions can be seen as operating a series of moves that are also very limited, basically 4 types of possibilities. We go into the technical details of this, which we won't now.
Universal grammar, so it's not only human, it's more general than only human.
Well, this is the, there's been let's say somewhat of a shift in Chomsky's general theory, right? Generative grammar is something that's developed in the 1950s, mid-1950s, late 1950s, and his PhD thesis, which is later published as the logical structure of linguistic theory, which is not initially published. It's published I think in the 80s, only in its full form, which is why sometimes the date reference is a little bit strange. And there we have a computational model of the generation of sentences split up in so-called X-bar theory, where every sentence will be separated into its phrasal components, so basic ones, noun phrase, verb phrase, object phrase, so on, and each phrase, of course, will be split between a specifier, a head, and a complement. Right? As Chomsky moves into the 1970s, the idea of the relationship between universal grammar and particular grammars, or using another terminology, the relationship between deep structure and surface structure becomes recontextualized as the principles and parameters model. So principles, so what this means, I mean, looking at this very closely, principles and parameters model means that for the first time, really, we're leaving the idea or the thesis that language is a rule-based activity. It's fundamental. Of course, Wittgenstein is the first one to really develop this idea to its full implications, in particular in philosophical investigations in the language game hypothesis. Right? Is perhaps not as evident in the Tractatus. And in fact, the Tractatus gives us, without its claim being made that strongly at the time, but in hindsight, it gives us a possible model of I-language, of innate language. Remember that the Tractatus sets up the idea that that a thought is a proposition with meaning or with sense, more specifically. Sorry, translating back from the Portuguese now. Working on the Tractatus on Saturday mornings. And so what that means is a proposition with truth values. So Wittgenstein will set up the truth tables and a series of different types of propositional forms in order to delimit what can be considered as the realm of thought. Thought belongs to the reconceived or redefined notion of world, which is the totality of facts, and facts, of course, are produced by thoughts or produced by propositions within this very specific technical redefinition of the terminology. And then there's the whole outside world of things, which Wittgenstein doesn't deal with, but which he argues is in a relationship to thought or to language through isomorphism, meaning that the way terms in a sentence, in a proposition, are related to each other, meaning the importance of the idea of relation to attribute sense and meaning to propositions is also the way we establish the connection between a given word to a thing in the realm of things. So there's no longer a relationship between word and object, let's say word and thing. What there is a structural determination of what meaning is in the context of a sentence, and in the outside world of things, there's a structural determination of what takes shape as an object or as an event, and through the parts of propositions and parts of objects, we have a connection being made, which belongs to what Wittgenstein calls the logical space. Right? Logical space is not grounded. Logical space is a metaphysical type of concept, and logical space is perhaps what we can, bring into the idea of I language. Meaning that we don't have to perhaps we don't have to speculate anymore about a metaphysical grounding to logical space, or logical space as opposed to ontological space. So the principles and parameters model is a move away from the rule-based idea, perhaps a redefinition inspired initially by the Tractatus, okay? and at least suspending or reserving the language game theory to a different aspect of language use. Okay? In fact, Chomsky, what's interesting in Chomsky's model is that it really presents a system as well. Because we aren't, it isn't like, Chomsky's not saying that intersubjectively circulated and produced meaning does not occur. It just occurs in relation to a specific aspect of language. Another aspect of language, it would be innate and would follow what the principles and parameters model is. And the principles and parameters model, well, the parameters basically is established by the phoneme, the nature and amount, a number of phonemes specific to particular languages. So what the principles and parameters model also forces us to conceive is that we can't stop language. Right? We can't say that, well, okay, these are the, let's say, this is the propositional infrastructure of language, and we can formalize this, and we can see their application in different types of sentences. No, the parameters are set. There's not a rule-based determinism. There's a series of principles which involve like recursion, as we saw before, locality, movement, and then the parameters that are established by the phonetic structure and the logical structure of particular languages, which would be the broad faculty of language, and limits, well, shapes and forms and limits, because they are constraints, but they are constraints that also produce creativity, produce possibilities, and produce freedom. Right? I mean, going to the end of the story, we have a deterministic model, so to speak, which is not rule-based. So it becomes hard to speak of determinism, and we have a production of creativity, or we have basically creativity at the very heart of the idea of producing sentences, of generating sentences. And who speaks of creativity? In this sense, in any case, it certainly speaks of freedom. So the relationship between the external and internal factors related to the faculty of language, here's nicely set up also in this article. So the external environment, ecological, physical, cultural, social. Then we have the organism's internal environment. So there are different types of activities specific to the organism: digestion, memory, respiration, and then the faculty of language in the broad sense, sensory, motor, conceptual, intentional, which would explain also its specificity to more limited language groups or ethnic groups. And then we have the internal mechanism, which is based on recursion. Recursion here means essentially that the construction of sentences is not linear. Construction of sentences is hierarchical, as we saw the last time around. Okay? Which means that within the sentence we have different phrasal components, and the phrasal components are organized according to a certain type of structure. Please, Sue.
Yeah, let me ask you a couple
Sure.
of questions related to this presentation. Well, even according to this graph in the slide, you can see that Chomsky's takes on language, or the nature of language, is very much in accordance with neurobiological undertakings.
Yeah.
So, one question that I would have for yourself, or for Chomsky for that matter, is whether, when he's speaking of language, very much in the way he speaks of vision, how children, for instance, develop this faculty of seeing and developing abilities to see and perceive, have visual perception developed.
Right.
So is it possible to think of language somehow as one of the senses, just like Aristotle thought of five senses: audition, olfaction, vision, etc. Because I see that Barry Smith and other people were speaking of different senses.
Right.
Today they speak of 10, something like 10-ish different sense, in this sense of natural faculties. Now, related to this, it seems then that Chomsky's approach to syntax and the whole thing of logical structure is slightly different from Wittgenstein's, in the sense that, of course, as you mentioned, at least in the Tractatus, I'm thinking of what you said about the Tractatus. In the Tractatus, if I'm not mistaken, Wittgenstein is still dealing with this problem of the logical form, as you even mentioned. It was one of the basic premise of the Tractatus.
Right.
And therefore, he's very much in the logical space of this discussion vis-a-vis Russell and Frege.
Yeah.
So in this sense, it seems to me that Chomsky is trying to avoid this mind-mind solution to these problems, and going back to the mind-body problem, even though he says that naturalism has completely missed out the real problem in Descartes, dualism, right? This is his contention against
absolutely. Yeah.
this reading of a Cartesian dualism, because people take for granted that, well, Descartes was, committed to this kind of substance dualism, and therefore, he couldn't make sense of these natural or neural correlations that we can establish in terms of a brain as what's really causing the mind, or what has to be in the, let's say, in the less analysis identified with the mind. It's an identity type kind of theory. And it seems to me that Chomsky is precisely calling this into question by trying to come up with, he even says that he's giving Descartes more credit for the whole thing of understanding the body as a complex mechanical system, right? So to see a human body as something that's so complex that could be even in terms of bodily complexity that we have to deal with the faculty of language. So in the same way that when you speak of vision, we don't have to start with some kind of metaphysical conception of vision. We have to understand how vision evolved, was developed, and especially how people learn how to develop visual perception. So I'm just trying to get your
Scenario, would you like to add something?
No, just
Yeah.
agreeing.
Well, first of all, just philosophy is not much of doesn't have much weight in Chomsky's conceptual apparatus, right? Philosophy is just part of the Cartesian sciences. So what we're doing is Cartesian science. But regarding Descartes, in fact, if I understand his analysis of Descartes and critique of Descartes, in particular dualism, correctly. What he claims is that, in fact, Descartes' model of the body was refuted by the discovery of force at a distance by Newton. Right? So in fact, the body as a machine or as a mechanism is not accurate in the sense of a contact causal dynamic that would be specific to Descartes' conception.
Yeah, it's more complex, but it's still.
It's more
You
complex.
can still speak of machines. I mean,
That's right. It's more complex. It becomes it's more complex, and it's not solved. Let's say
Right.
it's refuted by Newton's discovery, but it's not replaced by a convincing model. So if we are anti-dualist, claims what Chomsky claims is that we have to know first of all what we're refuting. We're refuting dualism, and given that we don't have a model of the body that creates consensus, meaning a relation of body and thoughts, it's pointless to be anti-dualist. What we have to do is to try to understand, or perhaps even understand, that sentence generation in the faculty of language in the narrow sense is a physical phenomenon. And so thoughts, perhaps in certain aspects of its expression, would be a higher order abstract phenomenon, but it would not be separate from other natural phenomena. It would not be specific to a type of thinking thing, res cogitans, or some type of metaphysically grounded category. So that regarding the idea of dualism, regarding the idea of body, we're looking at a very bodily function here, language. And language is a natural phenomenon, and according to this idea of recursion, meaning that there's a structural aspect to sentence formation, Chomsky at times risks an analogy regarding the constraints that we encounter in nature to create certain types of forms. For example, snowflakes and the phenomena of crystal also being or following a type of structural formative mechanism instead of a linear formative mechanism is something that we should analyze at further length regarding these so-called parameters and further constraints that sentence construction encounters in the real world, in the externalized or e-language aspect.
Just a side note, Professor Nitamar has mentioned some papers by Smith now. I've already included them in our thread, so if you want to check it, it's already available. Just curious, you know what, Professor Norman, I wanted to go a little bit ahead on this paper, and then I'll ask my question, because now I think it might be a little bit out of purpose. So sorry about that. I really just wanted to note that Smith's materials and everything else we're mentioning are already in the thread, so you just have to check it out.
Okay, I'll leave the article for you to go through. We have it's a short and extremely dense article where you have well.
Okay,
I won't go into it because otherwise.
Then I'll bite the bullet. I mean, here's the thing, Professor. When I think of Wittgenstein's model of a private language, or even his model of a grammar, it seems to me like an artificial model that he's proposing. I mean, I don't know if he's actually interested on whether or not language is natural. I think he just wants to provide us with a model that works, even if it is artificially, right? Isn't that kind of his point in the question of language games, for example? I mean, all I'm saying is that it creates a bit of confusion for me to, and this is really a question, to portray this as a controversy. Because I just feel like Chomsky, when he tries to point at, okay, so this is really not instinctive, this is not natural, this is accidental, but still, even though it's accidental, it's got kind of a necessary structure to it. I don't know if that's even controversy. I just think it's a different interest if you compare it to what Wittgenstein was trying to do. I just feel like it's kind of alien to put them both in the same picture for me.
No, the context of Fabrizio is the question of rules or not.
Okay.
So Wittgenstein, in the language game theory, will say that language is a whole process of playing by the rules of specific games. And this is what's abandoned in the principles and parameters model. So we're no longer looking at a theory of language that is involved in following rules. Okay? And that, of course, has deep implications, I think, on an ethical level or normative level, if we're looking at what happened and whether we're dealing with some type of biological determinism. What's the nature of the biological determinism here? Can we use determinism in any type of classical sense to describe what is being proposed here as a theory? And I think once we get rid of rules, we're into a different dynamic, and we pick up on this one of the points of agreement in the Chomsky-Foucault debate about how creativity and freedom are produced by rules. In this 1972 or 1973, their famous discussion, they seem to agree on this idea, even though rules in each of their views is not at all relative to a series of norms. What they mean is that it's structured. Freedom is structured. Without structure, without some preliminary structure, background structure, for them at least, it's the option is then to speak of a metaphysical type of substance, an indivisible type of substance, or however else we want to describe free will. But we have to posit something like a will. And over here, there's no suggestion of a will existing. There's no suggestion of a soul existing. There's not even a suggestion that there is a faculty of language. There are different processes, and so there's no real central command. Right? And Professor Tamar, then if I'm trying to dig up the memory I have of the references made to Mar's theory of vision here in various discussions, but I believe that one of the factors here that would differentiate language from at least the sense of vision would be the central sort of convergence or central organizer phenomenon that would seem to characterize vision as a sense, but does not characterize language as a faculty.
Well, yes, but of course, vision is not only seeing that this is blue. Vision is using microscopes, telescopes, science, everything else. So it's that's well, I can even.
What do you mean by that?
The quotation. Well, vision is very complex. You know, actually, phenomenology can be even. It's phenomenologists who know that. It's the the learning of how to see the world. It's a very good Husserlian understanding of phenomenology, because seeing is not only being able to visually perceive the
not just looking.
Right.
Seeing is
so the development, the evolution of the eye is very complex, and it is of course related to the evolution of rationality itself. I have no doubts about this. not
Okay.
only in terms of visual perception, but the way through vision we developed all different self-understanding of vision itself. Well, anyways, so
As a rational phenomenon, let's say, or as a phenomenon by which rationality is created, I think one could see perhaps its role as being similar to a type of scientific faculty and perhaps a creative faculty in terms of the creation of artistic objects and so forth that Chomsky doesn't include into the language faculty and suggests they might have their own specific mechanisms related to the organism, but at least in terms of this scientific, because the idea is that we're assuming here that we're dealing with phenomena that does not respond to any type of adaptative pressures.
right.
We may benefit from what they produce, and certainly we have benefited from, but, I mean, what is the pressure behind their emergence is another, is what's being put into question here. That there's natural selection behind or some type of adaptative pressure.
So I think that, I almost said Steinbock. I think that Tamar brings an important point here. The question of the blueness, the question of colors, I think is interesting here. That even though we perceive something color-like, our perception of something color-like and the correlate in language that we use to express to something that is color-like, I mean, it changes so much according to the way that your eye is physiologically, able to see that color. I mean, even the perception of red, the question of, for example, being colorblind.
Yeah.
But what I am more interested in is that it also presupposes the ability to speak that system of references. And this is the thing that I keep on returning to in this debate, that we want to, at the same time, have the necessity of language, but okay, what about the words we're using to describe this references that we're seeing in the world?
That's the point.
Yeah,
That's what I meant.
and I think this is I mean, I am sympathetic to the realist model. I am, but on the other hand, I cannot really be at peace here with the necessary structure they are implying.
Right.
Perhaps if they said, look, we should adopt this just because it's from a utilitarian point of view. Hey, it works better than an essentialist model, and we can do more stuff with it. But there are so many there's such a necessaristic language implied in it, and that's what makes me a little bit uncomfortable. I mean, it makes me feel like, okay, this would be so in such a way that it was written that it was going to be that way before this guy wrote this book. And that's what makes me a little bit uncomfortable about the whole situation. That it's not a hypothesis, it's a fact that our language is working in that manner. And then it's kind of a position from the end of the history of language here. I mean, I don't know if Chomsky would even dispute this, that his position is the view from the end of the history of language. He's giving us a position that is located at the end of the history of the philosophy of language. We are at the end. We are at the edge. We got there. And then this is what makes me a little bit uncomfortable here. Well, now we're just figuring it out, but we already have the codified.
Yeah, but there are some things that Chomsky will not bet on trying to define. One of them is the question here of meaning and reference. I think we have to separate two parts of the question. One part is what is the origin of specific meanings in terms of the referential let's say, a causal referential input to the determination of meaning. And the other one is the circulation of meaning. Circulation of meaning, I think we can see in various studies, and there's a nice book on philosophy of language that was published by Terceres, I think it's Terceres from Unicap's group on the distribution of words from central Near Eastern geographical space, and how words, if let's say the thesis on the migration of human communities, small human groups, is solid, how the words will change their morphological structure through time, and whether we can trace some type of regularity to the morphological variations of words. I think that's one thing, and which tells us that, well, words circulate in society and acquire specific types of meanings and applications and uses that are completely specific to cultures and ethnic groups. But the thing is that how even for a child does the process of word acquisition occur? So what is the origin of meanings? This is a completely different problem, right?
Right. But this one is very similar to vision. How kids learn how to see.
Yeah.
A baby, you say know that you are moving figures like triangles, squares, and circles, yellow, blue, and green, and stuff like that. They have all the first months, when being exposed, infants are exposed to colors, shapes, and all different things, you name it. But it's a process till the toddler and, let's say, a 4 or 5-year-old kid is able to discern and to speak rationally about perceiving, visual perception itself.
Sure.
And so in this sense, it's very much like language acquisition.
Yeah, they go on,
I think
they're
that
suggesting that the
Chomsky
child,
himself
even
believes
before speaking, already has a fully intact language faculty.
Right, that's the idea. When I was raising the questions, it's really, I'm curious
Right.
to know what would be a Chomsky's
Yeah,
response.
I'm
Or
trying.
what you think would be
I'm
his
trying
response.
to
Whether,
yeah.
language is very similar to one of the 5 senses. Most basic thing that every human being has.
Mhm.
And of course, if you think of, bats who have, some different faculty in terms of perception of the sonar capacity, right? This is very much in the way, by way of analogy, I mean, that a human language faculty would differ from other species. Like bats have this sonar
Yeah.
faculty.
Yes.
It's something biological.
Sure.
By all
I
means,
mean,
it's
sometimes
something
you
that
just
is
said,
anatomical.
birds can fly because they
Right.
have wings.
Exactly.
Humans can't fly because they don't have
Exactly.
wings.
Except that
But
in
they
the
can
case
talk
of language,
in
it's not
sentences.
only something that is there, you have this natural faculty or capability, but unless you develop it through techniques like vision, hearing, etc., you won't say that someone has this kind of audition or vision or faction. You have to train yourself
Yeah, but
to be a good
there's,
someone who really knows how to distinguish different flavors of wine. There is some natural component. You are born with this, but there is also the technical and the training or the acquisition aspect of it.
yeah, but what is acquired and what is
Right.
innate to the organism regarding language? Because there are two things, right, that I can think of as topics of discussion here to add. One is a series of experiments in which children are exposed to various types of sounds, and then they will be seen to pick out the sounds that are words.
Yeah, it partially explains. Of course, imitation and those things, they are not satisfactory to account for language acquisition, the way kids. Yeah, I went through the text and I realized that you have different components that help us, make sense of a language acquisition, but there is not only one way of dealing with it. I understand it remains.
And
quite
also the
challenging.
aspect about
Right.
speaking in spoken language
Right.
for deaf mute children.
Exactly.
Right. There is one actually is in this MIT talk that they mentioned, I believe, about visiting a school for deaf, visiting a school for deaf mute children that did not follow the conviction of that children had to learn, that deaf mute children had to learn a sign language, an officially created grammar sign language. And so there were different activities for them that were set up. But then what the researcher noticed is that when the teacher would turn around and design some type of other activity, the children would start signing to themselves, but signing to themselves in a spontaneous way that was not specific to a standardized sign language. So what does that suggest? It suggests that there is a generation of sentences in deaf mute children's brains that automatically creates sentences because the signing is not just creating symbols.
Right.
It's like expressing like what's going on or talking about some type of other stupid little thing when the teacher's not looking.
Well, that's good.
But
But at the same time, what's very interesting about their sign, their language,
yeah,
is that there is not only one there is no universal, sign language.
That's
I
right.
don't know if you know this.
yeah,
Each country, has their own sign language. Not each country, but the majority of the countries have. For example, ours is Libras, but there is no one universal, and this actually strikes me a bit.
Right.
Because why? Why you repeat? You have to. Why it's impossible? I don't know if, in a sense, this would go against the Chomsky idea of universal grammar. It just yeah.
But it's interesting. You remember the controversy in South Africa in Mandela's burial?
Yeah.
The man using sign language as so that was the thing that caught my attention, and I think it goes straight to that every single sign language speaker that was watching that could verify that as mumbo jumbo bollocks.
Right.
Whereas any other sign language speaker seeing a sign language speaker that was using another model, not Libras, for example, you could say, okay, that's another model, but it's a non-mumbo jumbo model of sign language.
Yeah.
And I think then you get back
Yeah.
to Chomsky saying,
Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
no. Even, we can recognize mumbo jumbo languages. We can recognize.
That's the point that Chomsky.
Yeah, that's I think
Yeah,
that's
it's
where
really
Chomsky
favorite.
would
Yeah,
go too.
yeah, but you
That
see
even
that-
gesticulation is kind of universal, which is of course.
Again.
You gotta contextualize it because this can put you in a lot of trouble, right? In Italy, not necessarily in the U.S., right?
Yeah,
It just
yeah.
tells people in the U.S. that you're really old.
yeah, but that's just communication.
What we're trying to say is that you would have a kind of universal, this is an interesting thing, an universal mechanism to recognize what makes sense and what doesn't make sense in any kind. And this would be in favor of James. This is a good point.
Even though
Yeah.
this sign
Yeah.
can mean two different things,
Yeah.
it definitely
you
means
know what's
something.
Exactly.
Whereas you know that, okay, that guy is just doing a little dance. I mean,
Well, this is
an
the upshot of the second experiment, right?
Yeah.
The upshot of the second experiment is that the different patients are taught the basic structure of various languages, like languages that they don't know, right? They're German speakers, if I'm not mistaken, with no knowledge about the language, and that they're taught Italian, they're taught Japanese, and perhaps English, I have a doubt. No? And then they're taught another language, right? Which is an impossible language, according to the principles of universal grammar. And and there is in the brain, through the neuroimaging techniques, identification of a neural net that is set up that recognizes unconsciously, that would recognize unconsciously that it's an impossible language because it's a different neural net that is activated than the neural net activated when the grammatically correct language is being spoken to the researcher. What would they be? Patients? No, subjects. Guinea pigs.
But this is not politically correct.
Yeah, but this is funny because, for example, if someone is speaking Japanese, I have no clue if they are speaking, no sense. Or, if someone is pretending that, that is making sense in Japanese, I have no, could be just being bullshit.
You
I
don't.
shouldn't know anything.
Yeah, scenario. You don't. Your brain. The claim is that your brain does.
But without me knowing, this is an strange
that's the bizarre point. You see, that's what I mean by the view from the end of the philosophy of language argument, because it's like, hey, even though you don't know your language is your brain is already in the position where it agrees with my theory of language. So your brain agrees with my theory of language already. So it's not even a theory,
A lot
right?
of you philosophy of mind guys, if I can group you together, like the Libet experiment.
Right.
And so, I mean, why do you like the Libet experiment and you don't like this this
I
experiment?
think that our brain can recognize it's a real language in a way that we could learn it, and that it can mark the differences and end up learning the language.
Are you sure about that? I'm not sure if that's the result of the claim, because of course the claim is made that when you learn a second language, it's a completely different process to the acquisition. Acquisition is not learning.
Right. It's different. Learning a second language is different from.
It's not that
The
you
mother
could
tongue
learn it.
acquisition.
It's like the mechanism that
Right.
well, they use recognize. Moro uses the term recognize. A neural net would seem to recognize that it's not a language because it does not manifest within its, let's say, deep structure the principles and parameters of universal grammar. But it does not suggest that you would be able to learn it. And having an acute language faculty does not make you necessarily a better learner of a different language, of a second language or a third language.
Especially the problem of plasticity, which is also involved here, because if you are, as a little kid, let's say from 3 through 8 years old, and you are exposed to 3, 4, 5 different languages, it's more likely that you're going to learn this language as
Indeed.
more related to what you're calling language acquisition in Chomskyan sense, as opposed to adults learning a second language. It's completely different.
Completely different.
Yeah. Shall we listen to Chomsky a little bit? Since,
Yeah.
Eu posso me expressar em português mesmo, eu não
Please,
consigo.
go ahead.
É que me fez lembrar, não é uma boa hipótese a teoria do Piaget, que explica essa questão da aquisição da língua e de uma segunda língua, a questão da assimilação e acomodação, assimilação, essa plasticidade que ele comentou, que em um determinado momento do desenvolvimento cognitivo existe uma plasticidade muito grande e posteriormente os esquemas vão sendo ajeitados com uma estrutura que vai sendo formada na ação. Não seria uma boa hipótese.
Can I say something just because it's a coincidence? The same passage where I saw this comparison of language to vision, they mention a Piaget and they say that this modular conception that Chomsky is adopting runs contrary to Piaget's conception that language is dependent on prior cognitive capacities and is not autonomous and modular. Piaget explicitly denies the modular conception. As far as understood in Chomskyan terms,
I don't know if Piaget's theory enough to really be able to tell here. But what would you see, I'll ask you the question in English, but you can answer it in Portuguese. What would you see as being the difference here in terms of the way I've presented the model? What do you see as being the difference in Piaget?
Eu não entendo muito bem a teoria de Piaget, no entanto, me parece que ele tem uma teoria pragmática. Então, esses processos não acontecem na mente, esses processos acontecem na ação. O bebê, por exemplo, ele a forma dele aprender seria através de estímulo-resposta, assim, na ação. Não no sentido de Pavlov.
Vamos dizer, na linguagem dos linguistas, é culturalista. Porque eu digo isso que quando eu estudei aquele debate Chomsky, vou falar em português porque Chomsky, Foucault, Chomsky, racionalista, anticonexionista, Foucault, conexionista, culturalista, como Piaget. Só, pelo menos entre assim o debate lá do Foucault com Chomsky. Ou seja, essa aquisição e os processos cognitivos dependem da cultura para se desenvolver. Bom, Prince é um bom exemplo. Jesse Prince, he says explicitly he doesn't agree with Chomsky because he's a culturalist. That's the terminology.
Yeah, but Chomsky's attribution of phonetic form as one of the parameters to the faculty of language in the broad sense suggests, once again, like I said a little bit earlier, you can't stop language. So it's not like you're saying that here's the deep structure, the inner core of language, and this is universal. There's no inner core that's universal to language. There's the relationship between principles and parameters, and one of the aspects of the parameters is determined by the phonetic structure of the particular grammars. So there's the child doesn't learn universal grammar. The child learns particular grammar immediately.
Right.
And the particular grammar is structured according to the phonetic, structured according to the phonetic dimension of the language. And particular languages are specific or specified or particularized on the one hand due to the range and number of phonemes that are characteristic of the language and that developed culturally.
Yeah, the development.
So it's not that easy to jam Chomsky on the culturalist culturalist question.
We can
No.
just see things apart. I mean, like there is a line, developing, and then you have Chomsky, and then you have like culture. I'm sorry, I'm a bit lost.
Well, let me see if I understand it correctly. What I was saying from this text here is that Piaget's conception.
Which text are you
prior-
referring to? The moral text?
Well, this is the Mora in the Cambridge Companion to Chomsky.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So it could be any other text. Okay. Piaget is claiming that you first have cognition. Well, a good example is Albert Einstein, because everyone talks about this example. Okay, the guy didn't learn how to, he didn't acquire language. He didn't demonstrate to the external world that he could talk until he was 4 years old. So one way is to say, well, he had some previous cognitive things going on, which is Piaget's idea. It's culturalism in the sense, it's not to say that, of course, your the way you're going to use language, your performance is going to relate to existing languages which have been culturally structured, etc., and have evolved. Portuguese came from Latin, etc., etc. You have the historical, cultural explanation for this, but I thought we were only talking about the phenomenon of language acquisition, which is, from the very beginning that the person is born, and the first exposure to people talking, etc. In at 3, usually it's going to be earlier. At 2 years old, kids will say dad, mama, or as Americans say, democracy. U.S. Republicans say, you learn mom, dad, democracy. From the square. Okay. So, even
Republicans learn Republican first before democracy.
Anyways, this is a language acquisition I'm talking about. It's not the way you're going to resort to a syntactic, because all the examples that Chomsky is using is to say that when does a kid recognize that you cannot say, nonsense constructions of a phrase, how they, naturally appropriate correct grammatical constructions of sense. That's the.
You have a specific area of
that's the
brain
challenge.
too, right?
Could you,
I don't know.
sorry, could you repeat your
You were
question?
showing Broca's area of the brain
Yeah,
that is related to constructing the grammar and really working it. And then you were showing in the image the I don't know how you pronounce it, but I think it's Wernicke area, where you just when you have an injury or something in that area, you just say things that don't make any sense. Chomsky doesn't say anything about that, or specifically about that area, or how it. Because you just
Well,
keep saying things, and you're trying to explain them with gestures, but you just keep saying football when you actually want it to be mouth or thumb or
Right.
I don't know. I just
okay, I'm not sure, I'm missing that information.
the Wernicke's area that you showed on the brain
Yeah.
image.
Uh-huh. Yeah,
If you have an injury in that area, you
Yeah.
can say things pretty well. I mean, your verbs and everything, but they don't make any sense.
Okay,
I want to talk to you about this cup of coffee, and I'm actually saying soccer and basketball teams. It's just, I'm saying it right, but it has nothing to do with anything. And I'm saying it, I'm not lying. I don't know why I just said it. It felt interesting.
but
I'm a bit
you
lost
say
in this
things
situation, actually.
grammatically structured things? Do you still speak in a grammatically
You still
structured
speak-
way?
Yes, but the
No,
words
I-
don't make sense. They're not involved in what you actually want to mean. You will ask me if I'm okay or how my day's going, and I'll say I really like pasta and I think it's great to be Brazilian, and
Right.
it does make it.
Okay,
But you're
so,
speaking properly, so there's another, I think that's another evidence that language is really like biologically brain of yours, I don't know.
but it's not localized.
Yeah,
I mean,
it is,
what-
it's that Wernicke area right there,
Yeah.
and you're right.
Yeah, but it's not the Broca area.
No, not
One
the
of,
Broca.
one of the purposes of the experiment is to prove the delocalization of the language faculty. So it would not be localized in Broca, but what's interesting in the result is that the Broca area is solicited,
It is.
although not alone. A neural net, and particularly with the recognition of the non-grammatically correct sentences or languages, there's another neural net that forms external to the Broca. But what's interesting is that if you, which one is the over here,
area
right?
on your right, yes.
If this characterizes Wernicke, if this characterizes, or if this is a localization, let's say a correlation of phenomena in which nonsense sentences are constructed, but they obey the grammatical structure, would go in the direction of delocalizing the language faculty and pointing to something about some type of contribution to the language faculty. So long as we're dealing with grammatically structured. If we're no longer dealing with grammatically structured sentences, then it's a different type of, I think it's a different type of problem.
Yeah, it's very,
But
as far as I know.
because they're very specific, the experiments are very specific. Did you want to say anything?
There's another region.
Uh-huh. I couldn't get the
For
whole
the senses.
thing, and I don't know why.
Wernicke, more symbolization. And sense that one word each other, there is another purpose.
Simulated.
So you can have a brain injury in Wernicke
Uh-huh.
and say with or without sense the words together.
That's awesome. And insanely awesome. Because when I say, if I have a verdict, an injury, I don't realize that I'm saying things that
Right.
don't make any sense. That's
So
the
you're not
crazy
conscious.
part. You're not conscious of it. I think I'm answering his question, but I'm actually not. And he
Right.
knows it, but I don't, because I think I'm answering it right. I don't realize that I'm saying things that just
Right.
make
Right, well, this is somewhat like the case of Phineas Gage.
Yes.
Right.
With the
Who starts saying obscenities like crazy in all types of situations, and he doesn't realize that it's not the thing to be said.
Because then again, it's like your brain doing things before you actually know to do things.
That's right, yeah.
You don't even know what he's doing. It doing.
Yeah, I don't really know how to interpret these types of, let's say, pathologies with respect to the specifics of the anatomical localization but the thing is, let's say the claim, because Chomsky, what's interesting also in Chomsky's model is that it's not based on neuropathology. It's a positive model that's based on principles of computation for one thing, and then is now benefiting from the great development of neuroimaging technology. But if we go back, if you're saying that you're confused about the relationship between the innate model and a cultures model, when you said you were confused.
Yeah.
I'd like to try to recapitulate perhaps. Because
I'm a bit confused about that, yeah.
yeah, so the idea is that, I mean, there are different dimensions, different aspects of language. I mean, universal grammar is not a grammar per se, right? It's not a grammar like we have, like our grammar, or like our particular grammars. What the universal grammar is a type of schematism of the possible positions that the inner phrasal components of a sentence can have, and what its subdivisions are. So it's not a claim that all languages obey the subject, verb, object structure. It's clear that, you know, in some languages there is a predominant use of postpositions instead of prepositions. Some languages will use infinitives to have a verb that is the subject of a sentence, and other languages will have a gerund form when a verb is the subject of a sentence. So there are variations, there's a certain number of variations, although the variations are not in very large number. So given that the variations are in a small number, the task is to see whether this corresponds, whether there are particular grammars, particular languages that contradict the model in some way or suggest the model is not complete. What I'm talking, I think you weren't here 2 weeks ago, right? When we did the, when we looked at the X-bar theory, you know, which is really where it's all at in terms of the model in its first form. You know, this is how it's this is how a sentence such as let me see if I can.
Is that Andrew Moore's book?
Yeah.
I think so.
And then, so Mary has said that John has seen this picture, is the sentence, and the way this is mapped in the X-bar theory is that, well, we look for what the heads are of the different phrasal components, and let's say what Chomsky was using at the time as the government position would usually be the noun phrase, and the noun phrase is mapped as having in its middle position the head, which is Mary. Each phrase structure has a specifier, a head, and a complement. Okay? And we can organize the sentence according to the tense phrase in which the verb is conjugated. Right? And in that case, the conjugated verb will occupy the head position. Okay? And then the noun phrase will be the specifier, and then what comes after, we'll have to see what the nature of the sentence is, but we can classify it as either a verb phrase or a complement phrase, and then you keep on splitting up or classifying the different components of the sentence. And what we come up with is a number of these structures that show how a sentence is able to be coherent or not in its composition. So that's what we mean by a sentence is composed hierarchically and not linearly. Okay? So the sentence is not analyzed according to the linear juxtaposition of words. It's organized according to the heads, and then the specifiers and the complements, and how the specific phrase structures that these compose are linked together. So in English, you can have this type of arrangement, and in other languages, the complement phrase will come first. You'll have components of the verb at the end, like in German. So this is the idea of the universal grammar. So this maps the logical structure. On the other hand, in terms of what occupies these positions is determined by the lexicon. And the lexicon is a function of the phonetic structure of the particular languages. But the phonemes are, let's say, pre-exist, are functions, are brain functions that are activated in the specific context of the use of a particular language. So language, this is what I was saying before, that you don't learn the universal grammar. The universal grammar is innate. So that's the faculty of language in the narrow sense. And what the faculty of language in the narrow sense is that it does is this creation of sentences in a recursive fashion. Now, what does recursive mean in this context, in the linguistic context? It means that sentences are created according to structure and not just word alignment. And moreover, in the first part of his description, will suspend any definition of the word, right? What is a word? Well, that's not defined. In fact, because of course we have the idea that a word has meaning right away. But when we deal with prepositions and determiners and this type of thing, the meaning is determined from the structure, and the meaning of a determiner, in any case, is something that's predetermined by the structure. It's not determined empirically, the or a. Afterwards, the specific meaning of the word, this is what we're talking about, the origin of the meaning of a word. I mean, how does a child pick up, what is the child's first experience with the word computer? There are just different descriptive possibilities there. Because perhaps, like we're saying about vision being enabled by the seeing faculty, hearing being enabled by the auditory faculty, the child can just be going around and that word can be picked up somehow, and not even identified to the thing.
Yeah.
At what point will the word be identified to the thing? Perhaps the word is picked up because it sounds funny. Computer, that's funny.
Okay. So,
But-
clarification. You
Right.
can have a meaning-like interaction with a thing before you have a word-like conceptualization of that thing. Right? This is
Sorry, you can or you cannot?
You can.
Okay.
right? I mean, that's the implication here, that you can have a meaning-like interaction with a thing before that thing has a name. For example, I'm having a meaning-like interaction with something. I am not aware of that something as a thing that has a name.
Yeah, but
However,
the
it
meaning,
affects me in a meaningful way.
yeah,
Or
but what meaning a child will bring to the computer when it first touches it and sees all these colors and things like that and doesn't know how to open it, what a keyboard is a meaning, a possible meaning, but not the meaning.
shouldn't that, what I don't understand is, shouldn't that make us more suspicious of this representational model then? Because, I mean, I don't know, the model seems to me to be extremely representational, as if meaning was on the level in which after we build, it's only possible after we build representations of the things with which we are interacting to some extent. And it seems to me that if our interactions with things precedes the level in which we are giving these things meaning, then the model cannot be so restricted to a linguistic representational necessity, which seems to be going on there, unless I am misunderstanding the whole thing about the Chomsky's notion of a universal grammar. Because it seems to me that the universal grammar is pointing at the necessity of a representational model in linguistics. That we only interact with things really meaningfully when we interact with them representationally. And there is something, I mean, I agree with that to an extent. I think as our relations with things get more complexified, for sure, we are representing. But it seems to me that we are doing some stuff that is meaning-oriented before we are even representing here. And the representation is, I mean, of course I am a phenomenologist, so of course I will say representation is operative on the basis of presentation here, and not representation, that even linguistics would be dependent on that. But that doesn't seem to be what Chomsky is saying, right? He seems to be saying, no. There are representations operating much I mean, I don't know, it seems there's something more
Well, it seems that he might be saying both things. And that what
That's
you're,
what's
what you're
confusing.
raising is the specific content of Ruth Milliken's article that we're going to be looking at on Chomsky's argument, on her appeal to Chomsky to consider an argument of language as a public phenomenon. This brings up other factors, but she questions rigorously Chomsky's use of representation in the article. And Chomsky doesn't Chomsky's reply, because the article is reprinted in the book that was initially in, I think, Chomsky and his critics. Chomsky's initial reply to her is that he doesn't know if she disagrees with him or not, and he doesn't know if he disagrees with her, if he agrees or disagrees with her, because she basically just seems to reinforce and complexify one aspect of representation, whereas Chomsky seems to use the word representation when speaking of the mapping of lexical items onto the language faculty.
Because this is the point in which I see Chomsky's heritage to the semiotic model in a more prevalent way. Because if you look at someone, I mean, like Peirce, for example, if you look at the way in which representation operates in Peirce, you have a first level, right, of presentation, which is only made clear by the time you reach a third level of representation. So you cannot even complexify the first level without the third, which renders representation as the key. So if he's doing that, it's fine. But on the other hand,
He is.
he
Absolutely.
is fine.
Absolutely.
But Peirce could only do that with a transcendental metaphysical epistemology going on the basis. And Chomsky wants to base that on physiology, and that's where it gets kinky for me. I mean, it's kind of weird, isn't it? I mean, to try to base a representational model on physiology. How can physiology represent anything?
Not if you think the mind-body problem is insolvable insofar as we don't know what the body is. We have. It's like if you want to look at the history of philosophy and science. Here we get this. This is what I mean about Chomsky's philosophy of science being extremely unorthodox. You know? What happens is that we have a different type of branch. We don't have this idea anymore that philosophers used to be scientists also. Chomsky said, until the mid-19th century at Oxford, the sciences were called natural philosophy.
Right.
And what we see as a result of, or as a branching off of that, is simply philosophy in some sense insisting that it's not science. And then another part of philosophy insisting that it is science and becoming science. But in fact, we're all in the dynamic of the Cartesian sciences that have split off and branched off in different ways. But philosophy, in terms of its metaphysics, is a choice, but
I see
not
that
an
it's
interesting
possible. I don't know, maybe, you know, because if you see the way that we evolve, like since we are babies, you know, until now, you know.
and we grow.
Yeah, exactly. We grow, you know, we evolve in a certain sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
This is exactly what happened. When you're a baby, you know, the first thing that happened is that you are presenting things, yeah, and you perceive the world in this, you know, a little bit confused way, but you are being presented to the world, yeah. Then there is the presentation, and then when you evolve or you grow, you know, your brain, the representations start. You know, and then is this, as you said, you know, then you have the presentations in the first moment, you know, and then you start to form your representations. I think that's a perfectly possible model to. You know, the first thing is physiology. Why? Because the first thing is the way that you know, you are put in the water, the way that you are in the water.
Yeah,
I
you
agree
don't
with
grow
everything
with
you
Yes.
just said.
As
But
far as your brain starts to, you know, evolve, you know, and I had the question of evolution because there is some study, sorry, it's a parenthesis here, that they say that if you see how the baby grow, you know, you see exactly like you humans have evolved. There is studies that say this. You know, you can compare, yeah, you can compare both actually, you know.
It's a
If you
development
see
and evolution.
development and evolution is exactly the same. If you are even of the brain, I'm talking about the brain, you know.
Right.
If you see, you know, how the areas of the baby are gonna, you know, evolve and things, you could see how, you know, the humans have evolved. There is, let's say this, and it's interesting that,
But
you know, then, you know,
Samara,
maybe, you know.
but what you're describing, at least as far as I can see, is a presentational model. What you're saying is that presentation constrains the parameters of representations. Whatever you are presented with, your world is constrained within the parameters. Your linguistic representational world is restrained within the parameters of
In a first
representation.
moment.
Fine,
Just in a first
fine. All I want to focus on the first moment, because it seems to me that what Chomsky is doing is that he's reversing this. He's saying that the scope of presentations that is available to you is limited by the scope of representational abilities that you have in language. I think he's inverting. Yeah,
But
because,
absolutely,
because
but
the
how can it
semantic
not
level
be
is
the
already
case,
named.
Fabricio? How can it not be the case when we think about it, you know, close to his argument, meaning that, first of all, you can't just create any type of sentence grammatically speaking,
What?
Okay.
How?
and continue to make sense.
Well, that depends. I mean, one could argue that Jacques Derrida does not make sense. I mean, I don't, but one could, and he's using grammatic.
No, okay.
James Joyce
it's
and
not,
so on, I mean-
no, it's not saying that you always make sense within the grammatically structured sentence that you use.
Kind
What
of
it's saying is that, are you able to, let's say, put it this way, are you able to add to the language by creating sentences that have no grammatical coherence?
What is grammatical coherence is the million-dollar question here.
Right,
Because
well, you can try it, you can test it, okay?
grammatical coherence presupposes a representation of grammatical coherence. You cannot have grammatical coherence by fiat.
Well, I don't know about, yeah, a representation, meaning a recognition.
Yeah.
But a recognition, you're presupposing that the recognition is something that is only conscious and not brain-based.
Well,
Because if the brain, let's say, does not recognize it, then perhaps you will have the ability also to not recognize it.
But
But the
can-
thing is that that's structured in the brain, and the debate changes because we're now focusing on the brain instead of simply focusing on a cultural norm that says you cannot
Yeah.
speak like that.
fine. Yeah.
And there's a difference here.
Yeah.
So we want to know why there's a biological mechanism that prevents us from doing that and recognizes when we're doing that or not doing that, to recognizing a social norm and rejecting the social norm as being too
And yet-
conservative or too...
And yet, every time we do that, we're using language to do that. Every time we are describing this model, this brain-like model that you are talking about, we're using language to describe it.
Yeah, sure.
That's the paradox here.
Sure.
Because if
Until-
Chomsky was right,
until
we
you-
wouldn't even need to use language to describe it for it to be a fact.
Well, he doesn't use it after because he uses the I language model, just like Platonists will use a mathematical model.
Okay, fine.
And he'll uses the computational model. Now, is the computational model language? Well, in this sense, it's not a language in a semantic sense. Although Chomsky will also question this very strict separation between semantic, pragmatic, and syntactic and phonetic, specifically in the sense that, well, we're always in the pragmatic environment. We learn, I mean, we only have some type of knowledge of what is in the I language due to the externalization of language as a spoken or signed phenomenon.
Yeah.
There's no, and for ethical reasons, well, we're not plunging into the brains of human beings to try to find, you know, what is being, you know, what is moving around when we're talking with the brain, with the scalp open for ethical reasons, but also in relation to the specific type of artifact that language is, we have to deal with it in this way.
I think if I understand this, meta language, they're kind of a formal structure,
Yeah,
That's a formal structure that's present in the human beings. And I think
it's present in the
wonderful.
human being, that's
Yeah.
innate, I mean, this is
So
really
it's
the
only
key
the
thing.
human beings. This is the point of Chomsky, Because, only the human beings, and this is what I think that's interesting.
I
I don't know if I agree or not, but it's very
No,
interesting.
look, first of all, I'm trying to find, I'm trying to first of all understand what's going on, right? Not to know, I don't want to have,
Position before you.
yeah, first of all, and second of all, I don't want to have like an unsubtle and stupid understanding of what Chomsky is proposing. He's obviously a genius, and I don't want to reduce it to stupid understanding, like, oh my god, this guy's just a determinist.
That's why you can understand why I'm rather nervous
Yeah.
talking about this.
But again, I'm just trying to find a ground here, and reading Morrow is not helping because it's kind of also confusing for me. Okay, is this a hybrid model? Or no, is he actually saying, because whenever we get to the point where we're pressed to say, okay, but is this determined? You said it yourself, no, definitely. There is a point in this where the semantic level is more determined. And that's what gets interesting for me. Anyway.
I don't have the, I feel like you're trying to fit Chomsky into a box, trying
Sure.
to- yeah, but you're not trying to understand him, you're trying to put him like in the tree of philosophy.
Maybe.
That's right, because if Chomsky's right,
But the-
philosophers are in trouble.
Yeah, I think that's part of the thing, though. There are philosophical implications to the debate he's bringing up, and he uses elements of philosophy of language. And of course, you feel like, okay, let's appropriate this through a philosophical lenses. And part of the problem is precisely when we get to this level that we try to speculate about, for example, the origins of language are pretty much speculative in philosophy. And then you try to put a physiological basis to it, which are no longer, it's no longer speculative anymore.
Right.
Right? And I think that's the key.
Brutal against speculation.
Right, right.
Anything that makes sense in the context of speculation for Chomsky is just a truism.
Yeah.
And that's
I
brutal.
think I'm just lucky that I haven't learned philosophy of language and things like that, because then I don't have the problem with Chomsky.
Well,
But our linguists following Chomsky. I was discussing with doctoral student linguistics at the Federal University here, and they don't work in Chomsky's direction. I discussed with her last 2 weeks ago with in Espírito Santo, someone who's working in linguistics at the Federal University, and he says that, well, no, Chomsky is seen as conservative. Okay, well, the generative grammar model, and most of the time, all the criticism is made to the first model. And Searle, for example, is one of the first sponsors of Chomsky's revolution, writing a very famous article published in the New York Review of Books, which is available also online. Perhaps Fabrice would like to upload it. But there's pardon me?
That's the one I mentioned in my presentation.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
The revolution in linguistics.
I think we shared this, but I'll double check and then.
And then with the minimalist program, so in the late 70s we have the parameters, the principles and parameters model that arises, where the reading, the understanding of the X-bar theory is no longer, it wasn't like that in the beginning really, but it's no longer seen in terms of a rule-based conception of generation, but a merging of the phonetic dimension in terms of a series of parameters that will immediately determine what the way the universal grammar will act in a given language context. So once again, the universal grammar doesn't act on its own. It expresses itself through the acquisition of a language that occurs in a child, a very young age, to the extent that some researchers in Chomsky's group are claiming that, well, the language faculty is already intact before the child can talk. Which in terms of a functionalist's theory, I think makes sense. I mean, it wouldn't really make sense were the language faculty to complete itself after the child begins to talk, given that the child is already immersed in a very specific phonetic environment and is using using circulating meanings in an approximate or more exact way, is expressing intentionality, conceptual intentional acts, which is part also of the faculty of language in the broad sense, as we saw. Right? So it makes sense, I think, in terms of a functionalist model. Now, one of the books that is often cited as beginning this type of program is The Biological Foundations of Language by Eric Lindbergh, who's a colleague of Chomsky's, published in '67. And Chomsky, in more recent articles, particularly after this new, I was talking about Searle, that Searle, I'll come back to that right away, but Searle in the 1990s, after Chomsky's book called The Minimalist Program, which is really the model in all of its detail and all of its complexity, published in '95 by MIT Press, Searle considers that the generative revolution is finished. And Chomsky rejects that idea. So, if one is criticizing Chomsky based on the generative grammar model alone, then the criticism is only partial. What's specific about the more recent developments is the call to an interdisciplinary model with neurosciences and biology, although with a lot of hesitation regarding genetics. Right? It's not, because if we're, I mean, it might be part of the genetic endowment, but there's no, at this point, there's no type of evidence suggesting that there's a genetic mechanism controlling all this. Probably, well, it's plausible that there is, but that would only be speculation. So, indeed, Chomsky is very careful about speculation. This book here, Morrow cites it in the beginning of chapter 2, just to give an idea here of what type of research program it opens. This Lindbergh writing, biological investigation into language must seem paradoxical, since in '67, as it is so widely assumed that languages consist of arbitrary cultural conventions. And this is, they are going against Quine, specifically against Quine. So Wittgenstein and his followers speak of the word game, thus likening languages to the arbitrary set of rules encountered in parlor games and sports. And it is acceptable usage to speak of the psychology of bridge or poker, but a treatise on the biological foundation of contract bridge would not seem to be an interesting topic. The rules of natural languages do bear some superficial resemblance to the rules of a game, but I hope to make it obvious in the following chapters that there are major and fundamental differences between rules of language and rules of games. The former are biologically determined, the latter are arbitrary. So he's still working with rules of language, but there's this biological determinism all coming up. And as I was saying, the very notion of rule as being, unidirectional in some sense is abandoned by Chomsky in the principles and parameters model.
Yeah, if I understood it correctly, it's going to come up again. This whole topic of rule following in Millikan's book, and the whole package of normativity as such. Because for us who have been to previous editions of these seminars, we're always going back to the same kind of problem somehow. Because when we are talking about being a culturalist or being a rationalist or nativist, innateness, etc., of course, these are labels, but this is only to help us, work on a contrast or to contrast opposing views. But of course, this is not meant to say that someone who is defending cognitive development, like Piaget or a culturalist, that they are simply ignoring Chomsky-like arguments. And the other way around. I think that Chomsky is very aware of these different arguments. But as I mentioned in the presentation about Prince, Prince is, because he's already, in the 21st century, writing in this past decade, he can contemplate different theories and say to what extent he thinks less satisfactory to simply, embrace Chomskyan take on the language acquisition, for instance. He prefers to resort to Jack and Dolph. And I started reading Jack and Dolph, and you have different conceptions and different ways of dealing with some of these problems, most times trying to combine one feature with another. And I see here, that we have problems that could be differentiated, whether they are talking in terms of, let's say, some foundational or saying, well, this is the point that I cannot negotiate, which seems to be the case with language acquisition for Chomsky or for his idea of a faculty of language, as opposed to problems of relating these features of his theory to other, possible combinations in terms of development, evolution, cognition, and semantics, because even the understanding of syntax, grammar, semantics and pragmatics comes under attack in Chomsky's analysis, right? It's not the traditional understanding. But this is going to happen with all the different theories of a language. All the different theories
why
of
acquisition,
Habermas or philosophers alike.
Yeah, that's why acquisition in the child is already a very sophisticated process, right? Because it does engage with sensory motor development. It engages also with the emergence of a conceptual intentional dimension. It's difficult how to
but the thrust of his argument is that you don't need previous cognitive process in order to get there. Yeah. That's the point.
Yeah, you don't.
That's where the whole thing of saying culturalist as opposed to rationalist is precisely this. If you're saying like an empiricist, like Prince and others, well, Prince goes as far as to say language is a human invention, period. Yeah. But this is not to deny that he's not saying that there is something is not. Of course there is, but he said that if you have to take sides, he's going to take sides with culturalists.
Chomsky will say that too, I think.
Right.
That's why he says that, well, language, this isn't language here. This is, when we speak of language, we shouldn't understand this in the traditional sense of language. This is not a grammar here. And it is not invented either. But humans do invent languages, absolutely. And perhaps only humans invent languages.
Right.
And these languages will demonstrate extreme versatility and creativity, and most of the time be structured according to sentences. Now, why is that? Why can languages only be structured according to sentences? And why is it that we cannot simply invent any type of language? And why is it that there aren't as many languages as there are human beings?
Yeah, and I'm saying this because the whole thing of rule following relates to this. Some people can say, well, it's only a convention. Let's think of soccer, all the games and the families of resemblances in terms of games. You say it's only conventional. Yeah. But this is not the sense that Millikan and others are going to precisely to attack this. It's more complicated than this. But in this sense, therefore, I can see that you say, well, invention, but you're already presupposing something else. It's not invention in the sense that a relativist or someone say, well, you just constructed this. Again, you have to see where is the emphasis and where are the points that cannot be negotiated. Let's say.
And then
Or
again,
in order to
then again comes the analogy that Itamar did with viewing.
yeah.
Because with viewing is the same. You have a spectrum of colors that you can see.
Yeah, but all these
You cannot
linguists
see.
use-
You
What
can
is
count
the
colors that you
implication?
know, they are not in your spectrum. Maybe the language is the same. There is a spectrum of
Well,
language that you can build, you know?
What I
And
like-
you cannot build languages outside this
Right.
spectrum. Then the
Okay.
analogy again, because this is the way that our brain.
Okay, but what is the implication that you two are drawing from that in terms of a culturalist or conventional or normative model? You're saying that it's more complex before getting to the need to ground it biologically in the brain, or that the conventional model is more complex than that?
Well, if I
That we have to
understood
go
correctly,
through the
Jackendorf-
unconscious first, or I'm not sure.
He would say that Chomsky's view is too restrictive. That's the word they use. And other people use conservative. It's too conservative. I saw that linguists using this. It's not in the sense of political conservative. In terms of theories of language, right?
Yeah.
So this is a linguist like Jackendorf, and
Yeah.
he's quoted by Chomsky for other things,
Yeah.
semantics and grammar, meaning. But in his view, he tries to get towards an intermediate position. That's the one that Jesse Prince
Well,
is also
this is what
following.
I'm trying to
So
put
he's
my
trying to
finger
have a
on.
hybrid conception that avoids
But you know
the
that-
extremes of someone that's going to say that anything goes, and it's going to say that everything is convention, everything is only a cultural, contextual construction, and the other a priori conception, which they think it's Chomskyan take in terms of a language acquisition. It's almost like, it's very Cartesian in this sense, as he says.
Yeah, it's an innatist.
Yeah, innate.
Not
And that's
an
why,
priori.
Prince wrote several texts on innatives, precise or nativism, to say that, well, this is precisely what he's reacting against. Okay? Because he's an empiricist.
Yeah.
So it relates to these different emphasis in the way you approach cognition or theories of perception, meaning, and language in philosophy overall.
Yep. Yeah. What I'm trying to pinpoint on, is what is involved in this conservatism, because it seems to me often the criticisms against Chomsky comes from a desire to maintain some type of Kantian unconditioned freedom, separating causality, natural causality from the normative cultural realm, and having some type of irreducibility between the conventional and the natural. And I'm not sure if that's what's being pinpointed to, because it's hard. It's at the same time it's hard to see exactly where the conservative development comes when the poverty of stimulus hypothesis suggests that, based on very little, already the child is able to, conceive of worlds, and based on very few components, we are able to create. I mean, the very nature of the universal grammar is creative and free. And what blocks the freedom and the creativity is the cultural reception.
The cultural reception actually would act as a block. You think that this is the,
The blocking occurs
because it's
in the pragmatic realm.
Yeah, because you cannot understand the whole rules because you're limited for cultural conditions. This is the idea.
There are constraints, there's structural constraints which are no different than what we find in nature. I mean, trees will grow because in a certain way due to their say, their natural makeup, but then how they occupy the space will be determined by other trees. How healthy they will be determined by how much sunlight and water they get. And so, I mean, these further constraints will determine their health and their well-being. And then, of course, the cultural constraint of chopping them down and then turning them into paper and wood limits their continual survival as what they are themselves in some sense. And I think Chomsky's pointing to that in terms of human development and the ability of language to actually...
Sorry, Nathan, but just, and this would be the reason why the acquisition of the first language is different from the acquisition of the second language.
Yeah.
Because actually in the first language we don't have the constraints of the
Right.
culture, and in the second we would have. This is the reason, yeah.
Well, I staying close to what I hear in Chomsky's explanation is that you have the constraint already in terms of the structural constraint due to the phonetic makeup of a language. So it's already the phonetic makeup which will determine how the language at one point will take its shape orally, right? But then after the other, let's say the other constraints, the norms that will determine whether the language can continue to be creative and to explore its creative rationality. Sorry, I forgot the second part now. I just remembered. So the very, in a sense, the very essence of the universal grammar is a creative phenomenon, whereas learning a second language can simply be a utilitarian task. I mean, like any professional who works for multinational corporations knows that they have to learn English if they want to advance in their position, and what they're going to learn in English is a very technical vocabulary, and they'll never read Shakespeare, and they'll never discuss philosophy in English unless they have the chance of having an English teacher who is an unemployed PhD in philosophy. But learning a second language has various, there are various reasons for that.
Children who learn the second language as children, 5, 7-year-olds.
Yeah, I think that's probably something very interesting to look at in terms of, is there only one universal grammar in that very specific sense of a child learning 2 languages automatically?
Because many children grow up in homes of
Bilingual parents.
bilingual parents,
Yeah.
and learn 2 or sometimes 3.
That's right.
Maternal language.
I think there are a couple of things going on there. One thing is that, well, some researchers in bilingual, multilingual children insist on the need to locate, in terms of complete acquisition of a language, it's important to locate it with an individual parent,
Yes.
to prevent mixing of phonetic and semantic form, right? Because this later on becomes a problem. I know this specifically from Hungarian and French and English, badly spoken English with a Hungarian accents all mixing up together. So I think that's after the child has to go through a lot of work to separate the languages and get them down right. So that's one thing. That's, I think, how well can you learn a second language after learning your first language, after acquiring your first language? But what happens when a child from birth is exposed to these two languages all the time? What does that tell us about the universal grammar? Perhaps nothing more contradictory, because what is the general model? The general model is that there's a generative computational mechanism that is responsible for organizing sentences according to recursive and other functions that that Moro goes through in the first chapter. Oh, sorry, I'm going in the wrong direction. Pronomial co-reference, locality, case assignment, movement, dependence, all these categories that he goes through in the second part of the first chapter, which are the big formal categories of the I language. Right? And so you have this computational mechanism that is part of the I language. Then you have the phonetic form and the logical form, and then you have a mapping function from lexicon. The lexicon is composed of terms that are a mapping function, but it's all mixed together, right? None of these are happening independently. The terms acquire word form through the phonetic components of a specific language. So these aspects will be present in the acquisition of the mother tongue, and if you're acquiring two mother tongues, it seems that it would be the same process, because the child is not learning the language consciously, as a second language. The child is picking up the language. The question is that how to establish differences. How does the child come to know that there are two languages that are being acquired?
Mother language, father language.
Yeah, mother language, father language. And does that have any impact on the nature of the universal grammar? I haven't come across this discussion in Chomsky, but of course I'm very interested in knowing about that.
Just for your information, on May the 6th, so the first Thursday in May, Professor Augusto PUCRS is going to do a presentation precisely related to this. Bilingual speakers that have been subjects to experiments with fMRI techniques.
Bilingual from birth?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, well, he did with different populations.
Right.
But most of them were bilingual from birth.
Right.
Because these were like children of Brazilian or Portuguese-speaking immigrants in the U.S. And it was part of his postdoctoral research.
Right.
And he kept working.
Yeah, he's a linguist.
He's been developing this for many years.
Will be presenting this here?
Yeah, it's on the schedule. It's on the schedule. It's posted on the website.
Okay.
I was just double checking that Professor Jaderson da Costa is going to be here on April 22nd. 15 days later, Professor Augusto PUCRS. This was the date reserved for this presentation. I just say that, of course, people are doing experiments with these.
And just thinking more about Sonero's question, I was thinking that all of the we hear very automatically, because it is a relatively infrequent phenomenon, but could be more frequent depending on the place in the world we live in. But that people who speak more languages are supposedly, let's say, have a more, what would we say, have a somewhat vaster sensorial universe than those who only learn one language. Well, one of the first things that put me into doubt But then I remember very specifically when I saw Chomsky, I think 2 or 3 times, if I'm not mistaken. First time, both times at McGill in the mid '80s, and the first time I think it was a lecture on linguistics to the linguistics faculty of McGill University, and he explained why he didn't learn another language, that he only speaks English, and that he wants to know. And there's this, his theory of universal grammar, of course, does not attribute in any automatic way greater intelligence to the knowledge of more languages. Because exactly, acquiring a second language, if it's not from birth, acquiring a second or a third or fourth language can be done for simply professional reasons or reasons having to do with having moved to another place, and it's just for survival or for integration to the community, or some type of romantic vision of Brazilian Portuguese that one wants to learn because it's a sensual language or some type of. I think that's the bottom of the creativity, the fundamental creativity, and the fundamental intelligence is available to all human beings due to the universal grammar, due to the language faculty in the narrow sense. And that's, I think, in terms of an ethical and political position, hardly conservative, and I I want to know, I want to understand more about this classification of Chomsky as a conservative in the linguistic sense, because I've walked into his linguistics more recently than I have.
Well, just say that Jackendorf was his student, right? So the guy wrote a PhD dissertation under Chomsky's advice. So he just moved towards a broader understanding. So he did a semantic reading of generative grammar. So this kind of
Well, what we know is that all the most renowned linguists today are students of Chomsky's.
Right. So it's to say that, of course, as we were talking before, it's not to say that you are throwing the baby with the water, but people try to come up with different theories or combining with different features. In the case of Jackendorf was precisely the idea of cognition, and he was dwelling on this model of comparing language to vision. That language acquisition is like vision development, or development of the ability to see. This is his main contention.
Right.
And therefore, that's why it gets closer to Piaget, because it's the whole thing of cognitive development, which he thought was sort of neglected by
Well, there was a big meeting between Piaget and Chomsky in the mid-'70s, and so that would be another point to go back to, where Putnam also participated at the time when he was working on
That, if anyone could present
The
on
causal
that
theory
would be an awesome presentation for this seminar.
Absolutely, yeah.
So,
Any candidates?
we have a natural candidate.
It could be in Portuguese.
Yeah, by all means.
We'll talk about it. Think about it. Poderia ser em português. Seria bom contemplar a ideia de fazer uma apresentação sobre isso.
Eu participo de um grupo de pesquisa sobre Piaget na Amazônia, em epistemologia genética, mas eu ainda estou tateando a teoria dele, não tenho completa segurança, longe de ter completa segurança, porque é muito extensa a obra dele. Mas eu me aventuraria, me arriscaria a colocar em discussão.
Tá, ótimo. Então vamos fechar uma data um pouquinho para frente. Okay, what I recommend is to listen to the conference that Fabrizio put a link to at MIT from 2011. Jump to I think it's it all begins 48 minutes, because there's like a 15-minute introduction of each of the researchers. All very interesting. But Chomsky really begins at 48 minutes and goes till 1 hour 14, so it's a half hour, where he gives an extremely dense, but really extremely dense recapitulation of the work done in linguistics. Otherwise, there are a few talks, excellent quality, available on the internet. Why Does Language Matter is one of the titles of them. There's another one, I think it's Language Design, if I'm not mistaken. It's a talk given at the Catholic University of Dublin, which is excellent with question and answers afterwards, which is very helpful in this regard. And there's also a big talk, the Why Does Language Matter was given in Geneva, and then there's another one given in Paris, where Stanislas Dan is in the attendance, but Chomsky is less patient with the questions because it's given to a linguistics department, and apparently this characterizes his high level of expectation regarding his researchers or his former students, is that they get things really right away. Okay.
Okay.
We're going to stop here.